and welcome along to the Property Academy podcast by Opus Partners. I'm your host, Steve McKnight.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
And today's show, we're talking, are you middle class in New Zealand? So over the next 15 minutes, you're going to find out, are you middle class? And what does that even mean? And if you're not middle class, what are you? And how do you kind of tell where you sit? And I thought this was such an interesting question because somebody was on the street, Andrew. I was walking down there. Someone calls, Ed, I listened to the podcast, so I've got one for you. Because I'm always like, I need some more topics. So I'm standing just on the street in Christchurch trying to walk into the supermarket to get my protein bar. And he says, I've always wanted to know, like, what actually is middle class? And I'm like, that's a very interesting question. I don't even know. So We've kind of dug into the numbers, we've thought about it, and we've kind of got an answer for you. But the interesting thing is, Andrew, we're pretty egalitarian in New Zealand, right? It's not like we like to sort people into classes and, oh, yes, I'm so upper class. yes. I inherited my mansion from my forefathers. We don't really have that. But at the same time, people love to compare themselves to the average and to normal and say, how am I kind of tracking? So, what's your kind of first thoughts on this?
Well, I do think like the class system, it's more of a British kind of thing, right? Over there you might have people who have got, they're big landowners and their families have been landowners for years. Think of like that, what was that movie, that Guy Ritchie movie, wonderful movie that made a TV show, Gentlemen.
That is a good movie. That is a good movie.
Right? So you think about those type of people. In New Zealand, the wealth distribution is fairly even. Like it's, yes, there are some outliers, but we all have somewhat of a relatively fair distribution of wealth.
No, I disagree with that. I think you're totally off your head. The distribution of wealth in New Zealand is pretty unequal. Like there are a lot of people who have a significant amount of money, but what's different is that even if you have more money, it's not like that person is unapproachable and completely inaccessible. Like I'll give you an example. So I was on the radio talking to a guy who lives in St Heliers, right? Mm-hmm. And St Heliers in Auckland. And he was like, I was just walking along the beach and there was Graham Hart, New Zealand, or formerly New Zealand's richest man, now New Zealand's second richest person. And he was having fish and chips on the beach with his family. So that's what I mean in terms of egalitarian. In terms of the wealth distribution, like it's probably a bit less equal than you think.
Really? Okay. All right. I think the thing we do in New Zealand is because we provide for people who need to be brought up, financially, that maybe you have less extremes in my mind. Okay. That's what I mean.
I always think this idea of upper class, right, it kind of gives me the ick. I'm giving myself the ick talking about it, Andrew. Look, I'm a Gen Z now. Because, again, we don't like to kind of split people and say, well, you're upper class and so you're better than anybody else. So I kind of like to call it like the wealthy class or a wealthy group of people or a wealthy group of households or an affluent group of households. So when we're talking today about like a working class or a middle class or a more affluent class, it's not that we're splitting up people into groups and saying one's better than the other. It's just, okay, we often have this idea about middle class. So what does that actually mean? And I'll give you a bit of an example of this. I remember having a conversation with two investors who were kind of working professionals. And I kind of knew that because they told me what their job was. But the guy the guy looked a bit like me. He had his shirt on, he had his glasses on. I'm like, he's a very handsome gentleman, clearly. And
how many people have come in with no shirt on?
No, but he was wearing a shirt rather than like,
shirt.
like a shirt with a t-shirt with holes in it. And even though he was doing really, really well with his money, he said, but of all the people you kind of talk to, where do we kind of sit? Are we the same as everyone else? Are we doing a bit better? Are we a bit worse? And so people love to compare themselves. So Andrew, talk to us about what those kind of three classes look like in New Zealand: working, wealthy, and middle.
Okay. And now I'm going to disclaimer this by saying it is somewhat subjective, but a working class person is probably someone who's working in a manual job a lot of the time. So often they might have quite physically demanding jobs. They're probably renting at the start of their career, and they're probably on a below average income. So they might be kind of 75% of the median income. So if you think about median income at the moment is kind of around that 70K, they might be more on kind of closer to 50 K per year.
Yeah, so if you're working full time on minimum wage, you're probably in here. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that. Of course, you know, I was saying to Andrew the other
Everyone
day.
starts on that.
Yeah, I mean, my first job, or one of my first jobs, was working at the warehouse, right, on the shop floor, and that's where I bought my first briefcase because I'm a. What do you remember? Do you watch the?
Yeah, briefcase W.
Yeah.
You're a briefcase W.
But I know you were a briefcase W
too.
as well. And so that was my first job. Nothing wrong with it. But at that point, I was working class. After that, I got up to farmers, and I was working at the Manchester section.
Still working class.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Do you know what? They've really changed their uniforms at farmers.
Have they?
I used to wear like a purple polo.
Oh, that would have been right up your alley.
And some black pants. And I was in at the farmers the other day. I was like, oh, their uniforms are so much better. They all just wear all black now.
Oh, yeah.
You know, I was like,
Much
oh,
nicer.
very high end, middle class. Oh, sorry. Maybe, did that joke come across the
No,
wrong
it's
way?
funny. No, it's
They might
funny.
think I'm a mean
No,
person.
It's funny.
So, you know, nothing wrong with that. But if we think about middle class, what's going on there?
Middle class, that's when you're probably, advanced a bit more in your work career. You've got steady jobs. Now maybe you're working less manual jobs and you're working more of an office job or something that, you know, maybe is less physically demanding. At this stage, you're probably getting on the property ladder. Generally speaking, you might own your own house. You probably still got a mortgage, don't get me wrong. You maybe have some other, investments as well, like your KiwiSaver at that stage. And your income's probably getting, you know, up to kind of that median wage, so that's $75,000 a year, or maybe, upwards to kind of maybe 2 times the median wage. So again, it might be closer to 140, somewhere between $70,000 and $140,000 of today's money.
Yeah, I reckon if you're looking for specific cutoffs, where I kind of put it as 75% of the median wage is the kind of cutoff point where you move from working class to middle class. Just if you're like, okay, we've got to draw a line somewhere, that's kind of it. So if you're working full time and you're under $52,500 per year, I'd typically call that working class.
There's no specific definition.
No, we're making it up as we go along.
Just making sure, because you sound so sure.
No, because people say, well, just draw a line in the sand, tell us what it is. So if I had to do it, this is where I'd draw it. And then I'd kind of say middle class is anywhere between $52,500 up to $140,000 in terms of annual income. And to be in that kind of wealthier class, $140K plus is kind of over twice the median personal income. So if I had to draw a line in the sand, that's personally where I'd start to draw it. But it also depends on what you mean when you say income. So that's talking about like one person earning it. But you could also think about household income. So average household income in New Zealand is about $133,000. So I kind of say, well, if we're talking about you and your partner, if you've got one, working class might be 100K or under, so 2 people earning 50 grand a year each. Middle class might be anywhere from 100K together up to 265 grand as a household. And then anything above 265 grand, you're getting into that really affluent or wealthy class. And often I like to get a second opinion on these things because
to make sure that you're not mental.
Yeah, every time I call up to get a second opinion about that, they tell me that I am. But I called up Calvin Davidson. He's an economist at CoreLogic, really good property data firm. And he said, look, I'm not really sure about this one because it's pretty hard to define. You could look at census data to get an idea of income and kind of what's the distribution. But people have different ideas as well, and it's not always about income. So let's say you earned a really high income, right? Like $250,000 a year, huge income. But if you spend all of that money and you've got nothing to show for yourself, are you really in that kind of bridging onto the affluent class, or are you kind of really just at the start of being middle class because you don't have a lot to show for yourself? Similarly, there's a big difference between, let's say your household is on a massive income, $300K a year, right? So by the numbers I just shared, you'd be in the affluent class. Well, if it's your first year earning that income, again, maybe you don't have many assets yet. Maybe you haven't had the chance to do much with that income. But if you've been on $300K a year as a household for 10 years, you've probably built up some assets. And so, yeah, sweet, you're well into that affluent class. So it is all a bit subjective, but it's just to put some numbers around it. Talk to us a little bit more about that affluent group of people.
So affluent class, again, we've kind of said that maybe the income might be over 2 times the median income. So for a personal income that's kind of been around that 140 and over mark, for a household, maybe kind of 265, so kind of 3 times that median income. And at this stage, like if you're thinking about assets, you probably own your own home, you've got a mortgage on it, might not be a huge mortgage now, you might be chipping away on it. You probably have another investment property as well, and or businesses. You've got something over and above just your house being your asset.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because some people will be earning over those figures you just talked about and say, wait a second, but I'm not rich. So like I was having a catch up with a really good friend of mine. She's quite bougie, and so she knows kind of the who's who of Auckland. I don't know.
I've seen her Instagram.
Yeah, I don't know any of those people. But what's fascinating is she was telling me the story about some friends that she knows, and they live in, and I think it was like an $8 million cliff top house in Auckland, right? I was like, that's some house. And she's like, yeah, they're in the early 30s. I'm like, holy heck. She's like, yeah, and they don't work. I'm like, what?
They don't work.
They don't work. I'm like, how do you afford an $8 million house if you don't work? And she's like,
Russian oligarch parents or something?
Yeah, their grandparents are actually on the rich list, NBR rich list. I went through and like was like, oh yeah, they are here. And oh yeah, they are, that family is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And I was like, okay, like that's a lot of wealth. To me, like those people are proper wealthy, like proper affluent class. But just thinking about why, even when we're sharing these numbers, you know, you might fit into a certain, like you might be on the threshold between working and middle class and be like, yeah, but I don't feel middle class, Ed. Well, what's interesting is there was a survey out of the UK and they went and talked to a whole heap of different people, and pretty much no one they asked came back and said, yeah, I feel upper class. Like only 1% of 18 to 24-year-olds said, yeah, I feel upper class. And 0% of all other age groups said, I feel upper class, right? So maybe it's that people don't want to admit that they're upper class, or maybe it's that people genuinely don't feel like they are like that far ahead in life. But most people, you know, 48% of adults out of the UK said, I feel like I am working class. Only just over a third of all adults said, yeah, I really feel like I am middle class. And one other thing that was quite fascinating about this is the age breakdown. So people who are quite close to retirement, so people who are 50 to 64, they are more likely to say, hey, I feel working class, and they are less likely to say, I feel middle class. So as you get, like the younger people feel richer, the older people feel poorer. Now that might be that if you've, you know, maybe you are 60 years old now and you've been in a real working job for a long time, so you don't feel rich. Maybe if you're 18 years old and you're in your first job, you feel rich, and so you identify as middle class. But it's interesting that people have this reaction where they say, no, I don't feel like I am in that wealthy class. So if you're earning an income above some of the levels we've talked about, it might be quite natural to say, I don't think that's the line. The most important part is you can let us know that you disagree with us. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can comment down in the comment section and say, no, I think the affluent class means this. I think middle class means this. Like, absolutely go for it. Let us know what you specifically think as well.
And I do think, like, again, we've just picked some definitions out there, and these are completely fluid. Like we're just making a best guess to answer a question here. But, you know, I think about some investors I met, and both of them work for a meat packing facility. So they process animals into meat, right? A very, very physically demanding role. Now, it pays very well. So they're both on $100,000 a year, like really significant income. So total household income, $200,000. Now, because of their job and being so physically demanding, I could think that someone could automatically think, right, those are working class people. Yeah, well, these are actually probably quite middle class, and actually towards the upper end of middle class. Like these guys earn serious income, and their assets probably reflected that as well. So these were definitely people that were in that upper band of the middle class, but they were working those jobs that you could easily describe as working class.
Yeah, I mean those are pretty hard yakka jobs, right? Like if you're down at the freezing works,
like first thing in the morning, right the way through the day.
And then there's a lot of overtime as well, so that can push that income up. but they certainly work for their money there. The other thing that's quite interesting, Andrew, is there's this quite cool calculator on StatsNZ's website, which I only just kind of found as I was like, oh, okay, like let's do a bit of research for this show. And you can go on, let's do a one-person household, so just a single person. Let's say you own your own home, and that home's worth $800,000 or $780K, because that's kind of the average in New Zealand. Average mortgage in New Zealand is about $310,000, so let's make it that. And let's say their household income, they've got a good job, and they're earning $130K. So they could go in and say, okay, this person is wealthier than 52% of one-person household. So they're kind of at that 53rd percentile. That'd be roughly about average. They can say, okay, you've got more assets than 80% of people, and you've got less debt than, actually, in this case, you've actually got quite a lot of debt compared to some other people.
It's interesting they don't group this by age.
Well, yeah.
That would be more useful, I would have thought.
That's probably true, because a lot of single or one-person households are people who, unfortunately, their partners died. They might be 70 years old or 80 years old. They've basically got no debt because they've paid it off. And in fact, 49% of one-person households have basically no debt at all. The other drawback of this is if you're a property investor like Andrew or myself. So Angela and I are a couple only. We've got over $2 million worth of assets. If you've listened to some previous podcasts, that's not news to you. You know that. We've also got over $1 million worth of debt, because we've got a lot of debt across the home mortgage and investment properties. And because we both work white-collar jobs, our income is at the upper end of what this calculator will allow. And so it starts to become a little bit less useful if you're a property investor. If you're starting out, you've just got your own home, the filters that StatsNZ lets you have on this calculator will be doable for you. But if you're a property investor, you're going to max out all of these filters pretty quickly.
Relevant.
So it's going to be a little bit less relevant to you. But look, to sum it all up, I kind of think that a middle-class family is someone who kind of owns their own home, but you've got a mortgage. You own a car, but, maybe you've got a little bit of it on finance. You send your kids to school. Maybe they go to university, but they're probably taking out the student loan. You're saving for your retirement. You've probably got some disposable income to go on holiday once in a while. Maybe you're allowed to have certain luxuries like going out for dinner, on occasion. But you're not massively rich. You've kind of got a comfortable life. For me, that's middle class. So over the last 15 minutes, we've talked about, are you middle class? What are some of the signs that you are? If you're not middle class, what are you? And also just how to tell where you're at. Right, let's wrap it up there. But please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Really does help us get the message out to more people. Thanks for listening to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Steve McKnight.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
We're going to be back here tomorrow with even more daily strategies, tactics, and insights to help you get the most out of the New Zealand property market. Until next time.